In this segment, I'd like to share with you the horrible crime of genocide and where we stand with regard to this horrible crime across the globe and what has happened through history. Let me start with the term genocide. Genocide is a form of one-sided mass killing in which a state or other authority intends to destroy a group so defined by the perpetrator. Now, the United Nations was working on this definition so that we have to have a common terms of dealing with perpetrators. And guess what? Stalin of the Soviet Union took issue with the word political and took off that word for years to make it acceptable to himself. And of course, many of these mass killings has been political, of one side versus another, of ideology. But in any case, the tribunal began enforcing this issue from 1990s, and the criminal court, the International Criminal Court of Criminal Justice, which was set up in 2002, is dealing with the question of genocide in a more effective manner. A little short look at the history of genocide. Genocide has taken place all over the globe through ages. Starting with, not starting, but perhaps at one point, the Islamic invasion of Persians 1400 years ago could be perhaps one of those genocides where thousands upon thousands of educated people were massacred, and then the others forced into another way of thinking and worship. Then a much worse form of genocide happened in the 13th century, where the Mongols invaded that region and conquered all Asia and part of Europe, and through an amazing system of genocide, where they went to a city and basically slaughtered everybody, or burned the city with its total population from one area to another, and left devastations that there's still remnants of that devastation of 700 years ago. Even today, if you go to some of those regions, we can witness what they had done, looking at the remains of those horrible years of their invasion. Then, of course, there's been genocide in America, in South America, in Australia, and then in Russia and China, particularly for disposing of the opponents, and in terms of the Australia and North and South America, it has been mainly the inhabitants of those regions, the American Indians, and so on. And some estimates put it into tens of millions of people who were slaughtered, or then there are some allegations of diseases which were artificially created, smallpox and others, that caused the death of millions of people. The question of Philippines and American War of 1899-1903, where it is estimated over 1 million people, Filipinos, were slaughtered, can be considered another genocide. It goes on and on. The German Namibia War, some 50 to 80% of the population were killed. Irish wars of 1600s. Russian expulsions of Muslims in 1860s from South Russia, and killings basically millions. then of course another, coming to 20th century, the Ottoman expulsion and massacre of Armenians, which is still in debate as to how many millions were killed and whether it should be considered genocide or not. It is another occasion. And then we come to the question of Nazis. We all know about Holocaust and the 6 million Jews, but then in addition to that, there were also millions of Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Serbs, and others, including Romani people and mentally ill, who were put to death or who were expelled, and caused, estimates say, between 17 to 26 million of genocide of these groups of people. Next, Partitioning of India in 1947 caused massacres of Indians by Sikhs, by fanatic Muslims, and vice versa. Then we have the China-Tibet conflict and the genocide by Chinese of Tibetan population some years back after World War II. Some horrible crime of Japanese against Koreans and Chinese when they were invaded between the two wars primarily. By some estimate, some 30 million people were slaughtered, some in the most horrific and sadistic manner in China during those years. Now, after World War II, there was also transfer of Germans who were displaced from one area to another, and some consider that also as genocide. Transfer of some 12 to 14 million people, and many of them lost their lives in the transfer. Then the slaughters of this century have mainly happened in Asia. By this century, I mean 20th century. In Asia, in Africa. In Zanzibar, I think it was 1960s when they had the revolution, and they expelled and killed many of the Arabs who were at that time rulers of the region. Then we had the war of 1971, Bangladesh and Pakistan, which was at that time of the separation was one country, and so millions were dislocated, intellectuals were massacred, and so on. Then the war in Burundi of 1972 to 1993, there was mass killing of Hutus by the Tutsi army. And then in 1993 there was mass killing of Tutsis by Hutus. A worse scenario happened in 1994 in the neighboring country Rwanda in Africa, where over 800,000 Tutsis were massacred by Hutus. Some give the history of this back to the time of Belgian occupation, where they were giving preferential treatment to Tutsis who were, in their terms, more handsome and taller and thinner, and they gave them the privileges, and that created real ill feelings and hostility from then on, and massacres started even after they left. Another crime of this time period, 1968 to 79, happened in Guinea, where a brutal, sadistic man took over, and he basically closed all social services except for security, and then eventually ordered all universities to be closed. and then with the close of universities and all social services, probably thugs were running around and intimidating and torturing people from all across the country in the most horrific manner. What had happened was that that man apparently did not like educated people. So people in businesses and educated people, thousands upon thousands were massacred in that time period until they caught the man and his team, and many of them were executed when the country was freed. Another most terrible crime has happened, of course, between 1975 to 1979 in Cambodia, where some 1.5 to 2 million people were massacred. And so in Cambodia, some 1.5 to 2 million people, including intellectuals and professionals and city dwellers, were killed by this regime, which was called Pol Pot regime, until after the war in Vietnam. There was an invasion of Vietnamese, and so they were. The war continued, but the main massacre happened between 75 to 79 time period. These atrocities continue. There's been genocide in East Timor, the dirty war in Argentina, this Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan, U.S. invasion of Vietnam, then the massacre of Iraqi Kurds by Saddam Hussein, and then the using of chemical weapons against Iranians in 1980s by Saddam Hussein regime. Then more recently, the massacre happening in Congo, and then Sri Lanka, the fighting between the separatists and the government, and most recently, of course, the disorder in Somalia, and prior to that, Ethiopia, where it's a no man's land, and people of one group or another kill each other off. And I guess we mentioned the question of the Serbian aggression against Bosnia and other countries of that region, causing dislocation and massacre of thousands upon thousands. And the most recent incident, of course, is the question of Darfur between 2003 to 2010, where so many people are displaced, millions have been killed, and there seems to be no end in sight in that situation. So this is the history. We now finally have a court of criminal justice. Unfortunately, it's not retroactive, but from now on, those horrific, sadistic dictators, leaders of the world, who are causing so much pain to innocent people, to people who may think differently, may want different way of life. Hopefully, this International Criminal Court would be more aggressive and would create some stability and justice to a very unjust period in time in history of man. Thank you for your attention.